Dovolte mi, abych vás tady přivítal jménem Oddělení současné kontinentální filozofie a jménem Filosofického ústavu Akademie věd. Jistě víte, o co se jedná. Účastníme se tady kolokvia prvního poprázdninového a po koronavirového kolokvia s názvem Svoboda a emancipace. Samozřejmě nahlížíte ironii mých slov. Je otázka, jestli to není první a zároveň poslední kolokvium tohoto typu, než opět vypukne druhá vlna koronaviru, která se nezadržitelně blíží. Tím spíše oceňuji vaši odvahu, že jste sem přišli navzdory zjevnému riziku. Samozřejmě nová bezpečnostní opatření jsou také důvodem, proč jsme naše kolokvium přesunuli zevnitř na tuto dvoranu, ale mám naději, že je to nejenom bezpečnější, ale také příjemnější. Úvodem mi dovolte alespoň v krátkosti představit obě dvě knížky, které jsou základním tématem toho dnešního kolokvia. Samozřejmě autoři své knihy představí sami detailně, já pouze nalíčím určitý hrubý konceptuální rámec, ve kterém se dnes budeme pohybovat. Knížky, o které se jedná, jsou Untitled Movement of Patočka z Phenomenology, což je kniha, kterou Martin Ritter publikoval už v loňském roce. Druhá kniha nese název Not so fit to break the chains, Marx Ethics of Self-Emancipation, kterou Dana Swaina publikoval rovněž v loňském roce. Kvůli karanténě jsme nemohli udělat patřičnou prezentaci těchto knih v loňském ani v první polovině letošního roku, takže jsme to odkládali po prázdninách a vidíte, že málem jsme to nestihli. Pokud jde o název tohoto kolokvia, zvolili jsme ta dvě slova Svoboda a emancipace nejenom s ohledem na ty dvě knížky, o kterých se tady budeme bavit, ale i s ohledem nebo s určitým přihlédnutím k té době, ve které žijeme, které čelíme. Samozřejmě toto kolokvium se koná tak trochu navzdory době, navzdory bezpečnostním opatřením, které nás nutí zůstávat doma. A jako filozof vím, jak je tohle uvěznění, tohle domácí vězení frustrující. Na jedné straně jsou filozofové zvyklí pracovat doma o samotě, ale na druhé straně je poměrně bolestné zažívat situaci, kdy se nemůžete s druhými podělit o výsledky své práce. Takže samozřejmě první motivace tohoto kolokvia je poskytnout oběma autorům satisfakci, aby se s námi mohli společně podělit o výsledky své práce a vyslechnout si nějaký komentář. Svoboda a emancipace jsou ovšem pojmy, které velmi úzce souvisí s tématem obou knih. Pokud se alespoň zběžně podíváte do anotací těchto knih, které jsou na webových stránkách nakladatelství Springer a Brill, vidíte, že ty knihy na první pohled nespojuje příliš mnoho. Jedna se týká Patočkovy fenomenologie, druhá se týká Marxovy nebo marxistické etiky. Ale domnívám se, že právě ty dva pojmy, svoboda a emancipace, ukazují jakýsi společný jmenovatel těchto dvou knih a těchto dvou tak odlišných přístupů fenoménu lidské existence. Pokud jde o knihu Martina Rittera, je zřejmé, že téma svobody je spojené zejména s třetím pohybem Patočkovy existence, které Martin zkoumá v druhé polovině své knihy v kapitole o médiích a technice, v kapitole o době evropské a poevropské. A každému čtenáři Patočky je zřejmé, že téma svobody je u Patočky nesmírně důležité a Martin Ritter se pokouší o reinterpretaci nebo novou interpretaci fenoménu svobody Patočky a zároveň fenomén třetího pohybu, který je pro Patočkovu asubjektivní fenomenologii tak důležitý. Když ale mluvíme o svobodě, dá se mluvit také, nebo lépe řečeno má se mluvit také o osvobození, o emancipaci, která je klíčovým tématem knihy Dana Swaina, knihy, která se zaměřuje na vlastně velmi dlouho opomíjené téma Marxovy etiky, sebeemancipace, která tento pojem vlastně staví do samotného středu pokusu pochopit Marxovo dílo v jeho komplexnosti, tedy ve vztahu vlastně k rétorice, ideologii, ve vztahu k tématu utopie a samozřejmě i k samotnému tématu sociální změny, která jako svůj základní předpoklad má určitý kolektivní historický subjekt, jež je schopen tuto sociální změnu realizovat. A samozřejmě ty dvě témata, svoboda a emancipace, která, jak všichni tušíme, jsou velmi interném vztahu, spojuje i to, co jim vzdoruje. A to, co na vlastní kůži zažíváme právě v době koronaviru. Uvěznění, upoutání, ať už doma, nebo připoutání nemocného člověka k jeho tělu, které bolestně prožívá, nebo naopak připoutání člověka k jeho sociální třídě. Není pochyb o tom, že bohatým se i v tak vypjaté době, jako je ta dnešní, žije lépe než chudým. Takže je zřejmé, že sociální rozpory, sociální tenze se podepisují i na tom, jakým způsobem vnímáme právě to, co stojí. Jakožto vlastně jakési napětí mezi svobodou a emancipací, a to je právě fenomén upoutání nebo uvěznění. Takže možná ještě přesnější název tohoto kolokvia, název, který právě reflektuje nejenom obsah obou dvou knih, ale i tu dobu, které všichni čelíme, by mohl být svoboda, upoutání a emancipace. Nyní, než předám slovo oběma autorům a profesoru Petříčkovi a profesoru Baršovi, kteří se uvolili k oběma knihám podat referáty, bych rád ještě poprosil docenta Martina Ničeho o krátké úvodní slovo jménem Oddělení současné kontinentální filozofie. Martin Niče je vedoucím našeho oddělení a jsme rádi, že dorazil navzdory všem obtížím.
Dobré odpoledne. To bude opravdu krátký úvod, nebojte se. Já bych chtěl poděkovat Petrovi Klubovi za to, že to zorganizoval, že se nám daří to, o co v oddělení usilujeme, objevovat nové prostory pro filozofii, tak doufám, že tenhle prostor se osvědčí. I třeba pro zimu a spadat sníh, ale já chci říct, že práce v Akademii věd je svým způsobem riziková a jedno z těch, možná to řekl, jedno z těch rizik spočívá v tom, že se z člověka stane znalec. Myslel, musí být znalci, ale je to nebezpečí, že zůstaneme jenom znalci. A my v oddělení s tím docela zápasíme a snažíme se, abychom nebyli jenom znalci, ale abychom skutečně kladli nějaké současné otázky, vstupovali do současných debat, a to i za hranicí odborné filozofie. Snažíme se nebát se experimentální nebo aplikované filozofie. A právě obě dvě knihy, Martinova i Danova, tak myslím, že jsou to pěkným dokladem toho, že se nám to snad daří. Jsou to výjimečně expertní díla, ale zároveň jsou to knihy, jsou to texty, které vstupují do debat, které jsou za hranicí té znalecké filozofie. Takže já bych rád tohle vyzdvihl, že to v těch knihách je. Děkuji autorům, děkuji hostům, že přišli, děkuji vám všem a myslím, že je čas začít.
Takže nyní předávám slovo Martinu Ritterovi.
Také děkuji za slovo. Možná začal tím, vlastně jak ta knížka vznikala. Když jsem někdy před 8 lety, si myslím, možná 10, to poprvé pojal vážně myšlenku, že bych napsal knížku o Patočkovi v angličtině, tak ta myšlenka vznikla z toho, že jsem měl pocit, že to, co se píše o Patočkovi ve světě, vlastně dost často odráží to, že ti odborníci nemají přístup k celé škále těch textů Patočkových a že často si vybírají určitá témata, aniž by vlastně znali dobře kontexty těch jednotlivých třeba Patočkových tezí, které zastává. Takže ta původní moje myšlenka byla taková napsat jakýsi úvod do Patočky, anglicky dostupný pro čtenáře, který neumí česky, který by zrekonstruoval vývoj Patočkovy fenomenologie a nějakou vnitřní logiku toho vývoje. Protože když tuhletu logiku člověk nějak nevidí, tak je vlastně sváděn podle mě příliš odvážným interpretacím, aniž by věděl, že vlastně opouští ty Patočkovy kontexty. To byla taková původní myšlenka, která se postupem času vyvíjela a z části i proto, že vlastně ten zájem o Patočku ve světě rostl a vlastně té literatury dneska je překvapivě hodně. Jenom za poslední rok, si myslím, nebo rok a půl, vyšly myslím 4 monografie o Patočkovi, když počítáme tu svojí. Takže ten zájem tady je. A vlastně mi přišlo pak i tím, jak jsem se snažil rekonstruovat ten vývoj té Patočkové fenomenologie a viděl jsem tam vlastně mnoho jako témat, kterým nemůžu určitě zadost, když to budu sledovat jenom chronologicky, tak mi došlo, že by bylo dobré vlastně jak si intervenovat kreativněji, to znamená nabídnout i nějakou vlastní interpretaci Patočky, která půjde dál za Patočku a která tu jeho koncepci ukáže jako nosnou pro dnešek, což ale pro mě zároveň znamenalo vlastně jako opustit některé Patočkovy teze, kritizovat některé Patočkovy teze. A vlastně z téhleté dimenze pak vznikla vlastně druhá polovina mojí knihy. Takže dneska ta knížka má 2 části. V té první části se snažím vlastně rekonstruovat vývoj Patočkové fenomenologie. Právě proto, aby byly vidět nějaké kontinuity, nějaké diskontinuity, aby tam byla vidět ta logika toho vývoje. A ta druhá část nepostupuje chronologicky, ale vybírá si vlastně podle mě klíčová témata a ty se snaží traktovat tak, aby Patočková koncepce pohybu existence, že té se všímám primárně, byla vyložena takže bude relevantní pro dnešní uchopení světa, tak jak jsem já schopen to vidět jako relevantní. Že to je vlastně ten celkový rozvrh té knihy. První půlka je rekonstrukce, která zároveň se snaží být koncizní, stručná. To znamená, že tam plno věcí není vyřešeno, ale ten, kdo o to bude mít zájem, tak se může tak tomu věnovat dál. Ale snaha byla, aby to bylo vlastně čtivé a přehlédnutelné, aby se člověk jako nerozplynul v nějakých podrobnostech. A ta druhá je kreativní čtení. Takže v té první části já začínám už rozborem Patočkovy disertace, již se většinou moc pozornost nevěnuje, protože se to asi většinou bere jako, že to je práce, která ještě není dostatečně jaksi svébytná, nebo dostatečně, že by v ní Patočka byl dostatečně samostatným myslitelem. Ale já věnuju pozornost tomuto textu, aby tam bylo vidět vlastně, z jakých důvodů Patočka navazuje na Husserla, abych mohl sledovat tu linii. Takže pak se dál věnuju Patočkově habilitačním spisu Přirozený svět jako filozofický problém. A vždycky se vlastně snažím ty spisy nějak zasadit do kontextu toho, co Patočku zajímá. A v případě toho spisu habilitačního vlastně zdůraznuju asi nejvíc Patočkův důraz na život, protože se vlastně snaží od počátku nebo se vlastně od počátku odklání do některých husserlovských témat, podle Bergsona, už je podle taky Heideggera. A tahle linie vlastně důrazu na život pak se odráží dále v válečných rukopisech, kde tohleto téma je, kde to Patočku vede vlastně ta snaha, řekněme, desubjektivovat fenomenologii, k tomu, že vlastně rozvíjí velmi zajímavou koncepci světa jako takového živého světa, ve kterém je kolem nás plno života, který nelze chápat, takže je tady nějaký subjekt, který konstituuje svojí aktivitou svého vědomí smysl toho světa, ale spíš se ten svět dává jako smysluplný. Je to taková živá souhra. A tohleto zaměření na život je podle mě jaksi výrazné u Patočky, zároveň vytváří napětí s některými jinými akcenty. A já se potom dál věnuji vlastně tomu vývoji 40. letech, 50. letech, kde vlastně se věnuji tomu, že ačkoliv pro Patočku bylo důležité desubjektivovat fenomenologii a v jistém smyslu vlastně v jistém smyslu učinit zadost životu toho, co není lidské ve světě, tak mu to zároveň to nikdy nebránilo v tom, aby vyzdvihl specifičnost a výjimečnost člověka, výjimečnost svobody. A toho vede, tam se zase sledovat na mezi 40. a 50. let vlastně zajímavý posun od toho, kdy Patočka asi z části pod vlivem Sartra, dobové diskuze, nejprve se přiklání k jakési formě absolutního humanismu, to znamená vlastně k jakémusi absolutnímu důrazu na člověka v té jeho svobodě a vlastně na zdůraznění právě té autonomie lidského subjektu, toho, že ty svobodné aktivity člověka jsou to podstatné. K tomu, co pak je vlastně velmi známý text, často komentovaný text 50. let, negativní platonismus, kde se objevuje důraz na ideu jako něco, co vlastně této aktivitě subjektu vždycky přichází jako protipol, nebo lépe řečeno vlastně zakládá nakonec tu aktivitu toho subjektu. Ta idea je tím podstatnou. Pak sleduju ten vývoj Patočky dál a v 60. letech, už od poloviny 60. let, řekněme, se chystá to, co pak se stane vlastně často komentovaným konceptem patočkovým, kterému já se pak věnu v té druhé části té knihy, to je koncepce pohybu existence. A vlastně sleduji tu koncepci a následně to, jak Patočka rozvíjí to, co je také známo, to znamená koncepci asubjektivní fenomenologie, kde tím mým cílem není vlastně ukazovat nějakou genezi a vnitřní nerozpornost, nebo genezi na jedné straně, na druhé straně nějakou konciznost koncepce asubjektivní fenomenologie. Spíš vlastně mám trochu opačný záměr a to poukázat na to, že v té snaze vypracoval asubjektivní fenomenologii nebo nauku o zjevování jako takovém, se vlastně u Patočky v těch 60. a 70. letech hlavně jak si zdá se tlučou různé přístupy, které podle mě nelze vlastně uvést do harmonie. A to je takový negativní závěr můj, který zároveň slouží mně jako opora pro tvrzení, že to, co je naopak slibné u toho Patočky, je ta koncepce pohybu existence, kterou můžeme pojmout jako to, co je nosné. A proto já se teda vycházím z té koncepce pohybu existence a v druhé části se věnuju vlastně tématům, které v té první části byly naznačeny. Začínám rozborem těla a tělesnosti. Z části proto, abych se vymezil vůči některým vlivným interpretacím, kde se vlastně snažím ukázat, že vlastně tělo je zásadní, když tematizujeme zjevování, tělo je zásadní pro asubjektivní fenomenologii, tělo je zásadní pro nauku o pohybech existence. Nicméně existuje ontologicky relevantní rozdíl mezi tělem a duší Patočky a tenhle je potřeba zachovat. A v návaznosti na ten krok pak se věnuju cíleně té koncepci péče o duši, také známé Patočky koncepce péče o duši. A snažím se vlastně zodpovědět otázku, co je duše podle Patočky. Jestli tenhle ten koncept jako dává smysl a jestli tím Patočka teda třeba neupadá do nějakých již překonaných koncepcí. A vlastně soustředím pozornost na ten moment samopohybu, který Patočka zdůrazňuje. To znamená, duše je to, co může hýbat samo sebou. Člověk je teda tím, kdo je svobodný právě proto, že může sám sebou stát se principem svého pohybu. Nicméně vlastně lze ukázat, že ten pohyb existence je vždy již v pohybu. Takže nelze říci ani tak, že by duše byla něco, co předchází tomu pohybu, ale duše je vlastně v tom pohybu samotném. Je vlastně tím tou schopností toho pohybu vlastně reflektovat a cítit sebe sama. Takže když to řeknu nějak ještě vyhroceně, vlastně duše není něco, ale duše je spíš jako by ta samotná péče, která tam probíhá. Že péče o duši je vlastně péče o duši není péče o něco, ale péčí o to, aby ten pohyb probíhal, vlastně ten sebevztah. Takže ten koncept duše není nějaký substancialistický, ale vlastně v návaznosti na Arentovou a Aristotela a další myslitele Patočka rozvíjí vlastně velmi svou originální koncepci toho, co je duše. No a zároveň ten pohyb existence je naukou, která má Patočkovi umožnit vykládat historičnost. A tady se dostávám k tomu, co už taky naznačil Petr Koupal, že vlastně ta moje interpretace Patočky vlastně, dalo se říct, že ta zásadní námitka, kterou já vůči Patočkovi formuluji, je ta v kontextu nauky o pohybech existence, je námitka, která už se objevila v různých formách, že je tam vlastně položen přílišný důraz na třetí pohyb, jako ten pohyb, který je jedině svobodný, který je nakonec vlastně jedině lidský. A dochází k určitému upozadění toho prvního a druhého pohybu existence, toho pohybu zakořenění Patočky, teda toho pohybu, jímž přijímáme to, co už je, a toho druhého pohybu, to znamená toho pohybu práce, toho pohybu sebeprodloužení, jak jim taky Patočka říká. Takže tyhle dva pohyby jsou pojaty jako něco nehistorického, historie vlastně nezakládajícího, nebo řečeno opatrněji, tyto dva pohyby nezakládají historii v pravém slova smyslu. Jenom ten třetí pohyb je v skutečném smyslu historický a v skutečném slova smyslu lidský. A já se snažím vlastně ukázat, že když přijmeme tuhletu koncepci, tak vlastně nebudeme schopni nahlédnout lidskou existenci v její komplexitě. A to je vlastně hlavní, to je gro té druhé části, kde já se snažím vtáhnout do hry nějaké koncepce, které se vypůjčují odinut, hlavně teda ze současné mediální filosofie v Německu rozvíjené. Já se snažím důrazem na kulturní techniky vlastně ukázat, že ten pohyb svobody je vždycky již závislý na objektivitě a vlastně, že nedává smysl představovat si tu svobodu jinak, než jako vždy již probíhající závislosti na objektivitách, na tom, co vlastně by se řeklo v té perspektivě jako ostré kontrapozice svoboda, nesvoboda je nesvoboda. Vlastně se snažím zdůraznit ten aspekt, že svoboda je vždycky vlastně podmíněná svobodou. Řečeno jednoduše a vlastně takovou prázdnou flosku. A to je vlastně to gro té druhé části. A to gro, řekl bych, té mé intervence do patočkovského bádání vlastně, což sebou nese taky zároveň jaksi potlačení řekněme, důrazu na určitým způsobem chápanou transcendenci. Vlastně se dalo říct, jako, že já ten koncept transcendence se snažím myslet velmi, to říct, jaksi světsky nebo pozemsky. A celá ta knížka končí vlastně úvahou, která jde v této linii, o tom, jak máme pojímat vztah konečná a nekonečná u Patočky, kde se opírám některé jeho texty a i vlastně polemice vůči určitému čtení Patočky, kde se častému čtení, které klade důraz na ten pojem polemos, pojem boje u pozdního Patočky, tak se snažím říct, že to, co je pro Patočku klíčové, pro pozdního Patočku určitě je pojem lásky. Lásky jako aktivity, která je aktivitou sebepřekonání. A že vlastně tato aktivita sebepřekonání je tou jedinou formou, jak můžeme překonat konečnost. Aniž bychom vlastně ale se v této aktivitě jaksi zbavovali své pozemskosti. Vlastně konečnost je to stávání se nekonečným skrze pozemské věci, myslím. Takže je tam potřeba zahrnout všechny ty tři pohyby, nejenom třetí pohyb. Tak, to je asi všechno, co bych teďka k tomu mohl říct.
Já bych mluvil poprosil profesora Petříčka, protože by mohl poskytnout svůj názor na tuhle problematiku.
Ne, názor neposkytnu. Jenom na začátek musím říct, mě nevadí, když musím zůstat doma. Mě vyhovuje, když se nemusím se svýma myšlenkama dělit. Co potom člověka uvádí skutečně do zmatku a vůbec je to prostě chaotická situace, takže tady se necítí práce na své svobodě. Druhá věc. Referát by měl sloužit pro zhrnutí diskuze a ne k tomu, abych já něco říkal. Takže já se spíš soustředím na místa, o kterých si myslím, že by bylo zajímavé se o nich bavit. Ta Martinova kniha je mi sympatická proto, protože při velmi pozorném čtení člověk přijde na to, že Martin argumentuje tak, aby mohl napsat závěr. To si myslím, že je velmi správné. Jo, prostě ta interpretace má vést někam mimo ten text a to spojení s tou mediální filozofií je skutečně něco, co pokládám za velmi originální. A ještě se k tomu vrátím. Druhá věc, zase pozornější čtení ukáže, že i když třeba Martin to nějak zvlášť si nezdůrazňuje, že v tom Patočkově konceptu je vlastně jakési zvláštní napětí, které vychází najevo až později. To napětí je v tom, že přirozený svět, to první vydání, tak jako celá Husserlova fenomenologie, je deskripce struktury. A to je něco, co Patočka dlouho neopouští a dokonce si myslím, že v okamžiku, kdy začne sebe reinterpretovat a ten přirozený svět převádí na problematiku tří pohybů lidské existence, takže je to vlastně zase popis struktury. Jo, je to určitá struktura lidské existence, struktura starosti, heideggersky řečeno a tak. A tím vlastně se, jak si ta fenomenologie tohoto typu vyráží z ruky prostředky, jak se chopit dějin. To je problém celé geneze a struktury a tak. To je fenomenologie celkem publičkaný téma. A vlastně Patočkovi kacířský esej najednou jsou věnovaný, ale takovým mikroskopickým způsobem problému dějin. Takže si myslím, že tohle je jedno z témat, o kterých bychom se mohli bavit, do jaké míry vůbec to Patočkovo myšlení, jakkoliv uvažuje v době evropský a poevropský a našli bychom tam spoustu náznaků, do jaké míry je schopný skutečně se nějak vyrovnat s problémem dějin. Tím spíše, že jako žád Husserlův a Heideggerův samozřejmě je poznamenán šílenou ontologizací dějinů Heideggera. Heidegger zná dějiny jenom ve formě Geschichtlichkeit, čili vlastně jakýhosi ontologického pohybu, a empirické dějiny jsou pro něj vlastně něco, čím se filozof vůbec nezabývá. A tady, i když to říkám nerad, je zajímavá polemika Pavla Rittera z toho, myslím, třetího svazku času a vyprávění, kde vlastně se snaží velmi přesvědčivě ukázat, že prostě ať dělá Heidegger co chce, tak se mu nikdy nepodaří oddělit to ontického od ontologického problému dějin. Ta empirie je vždycky něco, co ho nutí formulovat ty ontologické dějiny určitým způsobem. Tam prostě je to kontaminované. A to si myslím, že vlastně je možná určitý úskalí i tam, kde Patočka se začal vážně zabývat problémem dějin. Takže tahle ta ontologizace dějin tam pořád hraje určitou roli a tady bych řekl, že to je vidět právě na tom třetím pohybu, který u něj skutečně začíná být dominantní. Což z hlediska vlastně striktně strukturního není logické. Tak to je jedna věc, o které si myslím, že se dá velmi vhodně diskutovat. Druhá, to je takový složitější. Asubjektivní fenomenologie. Tady si myslím, že ano, ve své době, kdy Patočka psal o subjektivní fenomenologii, to byl určitý pokus překročit upředu. Zároveň ale se tenhle ten pokus, když ještě vezmeme do úvahy různý diskuze o Heideggerovi, do jaký míry Dasein je vlastně jenom synonymum pro subjekta. Zároveň se vlastně tenhle ten Patočku pokus o asubjektivní fenomenologii dostal do těsného sousedství takových těch snah zbavit se pojmu subjekt. Jako něčeho, co prostě je subjekt. A různě potom pracovat na různých konceptech, kde se prostě toho subjektu obejde. Ale ono to netrvalo dlouho. A zejména třeba francouzská fenomenologie najednou vlastně jakoby začali ten subjekt chybět. Ne snad v tom tradičním významu slova subjekt, ale jako třeba u Jeana-Luca Nancyho tělo spolubytí s druhými a já jako ten, kdo pouze v tomto spolubytí může být sám sebou a tak dále. A vlastně celá ta krajina se jakoby přestrukturovala, takže vlastně smysl není, člověk není ten, kdo dává smysl, ale kdo je mu vystaven. A to svojí tělesností a tak dále. A do jisté míry si myslím, že některé momenty toho, co v tom klasickém myšlení bylo byť potlačeným způsobem přítomno v tom pojmu subjektu, pojmu já a pojmu více, takže se najednou vrací a že jakýsi radikální a subjektivní koncepty si nejsou na míru naší doby. Což bych zakončil známým heslem zejména těch francouzských ekologů radikálních, kteří říkají, my nechráníme přírodu, my jsme přírodu, která se brání. No. To si myslím, že je velmi pozoruhodná věc, že tady je skutečně si najednou bylo východisko pro nějaký zvláštní typ myšlení, nemyslím snad o subjektu, ale těžko říct, no. Je to velmi zajímavé. No a potom třetí poznámka, to byl velmi stručnej. Ta se ovšem týká toho, co je na té Martinově knize asi nejoriginálnější, to je to propojení s mediální filozofií, respektive s pojmem média. To znamená, že Martin se snaží ukázat, že by bylo možné, jestli se nemýlím, ty tři pohyby existenci chápat jako médium existence. To je velmi pozoruhodné, o tom můžeme diskutovat. Já jenom upozorním na... Ne, mně se to líbí, ale jsou tam určitý zádrhelci. Zádrhelci, který zase by asi vyžadovali, aby s trochu s tím pojmem média pracoval aktivně. Protože ty a teď už nemyslím klasický pojmy média, ale i ty, co jsou v německý filozofie, a i v těch kulturních technikách. Přece jenom toho média vlastně zdůrazňují, ať už v jakýmkoliv smyslu, vztah médium mezi. To, že médium samé mezi co tak dále, ale to, že to nějak účastní na té zprávě nebo to takovýho, to je jedna věc. Čili, že to je vlastně dost taksi striktně definovaný termín a tady ještě docela něco udělat. A druhá věc vlastně neméně zajímavá je, že ve většině těch úvah se vlastně jakoby skrze reflexy na tradiční pojetí média ukazuje, co v tom tradičním pojetí média bylo vytěsňováno, to je skrytá materiální média. No. Druhý pohyb je to zajímavá věc. No a já myslím, že tohle je to pro začátek stačí, že by se dalo o něčem diskutovat. Takže já končím.
Myslím, že teď se sluší, aby jsme dali Martinovi příležitost zachránit jeho reputaci a nějakým způsobem zareagovat na to, co tady zaznělo. A potom už můžeme samozřejmě otevřít diskuzi.
Děkuji moc.
Když mě to nebavilo, tak bych o tom nemluvil.
Ne, já se necítím nějakou naznačku. Já se necítím nějak nucen obhajovat svoji pozici. To je všechno pravda, a je toho moc naraz. Takže já už jsem pak ztratil vlastně schopnost si to srovnat v hlavě postupně. Jenom teďka mi přišlo vlastně s tím posledním bodem, že on se trochu jako vrací k tomu prvnímu vlastně a k tomu jako k tomu, co vlastně mě postupně vyvstalo, že mě u toho Patočky chybí. A teďka teprve jako ex post trochu zjišťuju, že vlastně už jako tady poslední 20 let byli i jiní autoři, kteří mimo Patočku vlastně šli podobným směrem, což mě docela těší, že aspoň bude se docela dál opřít. A to je vlastně, proč já tam zavádím ten pojem toho média, na který si pohybuje právě proto, že mám pocit, že tam vlastně, že to umožní zohlednit tu materialitu v těch pohybech, která v každém z těch pohybů má jiný charakter. Vlastně samozřejmě, že prostě v tom pohybu zakořenění bude spojená s tou tělesností, v tom druhém pohybu bude spojená s tím, co vlastně zajišťuje v nejširším slova smyslu nějakou tu ekonomickou jako obživu, jako ten ekonomický proces toho jako sebereprodukce i v tom jako celospolečenském kontextu. A samozřejmě jakoby to jako důležitý gesto, který jsem tam měl, ale myslím, že není to dotažený, je právě je potřeba ukázat, že v tom třetím pohybu máme taky co dělat s různými formami materiality. Takže vlastně myslím, že ta základní chyba, kterou tam, nebo ten základní nedostatek, nebo ta slabina, která tam u toho Patočky je, že vlastně ten třetí pohyb jako od tohohle úplně poprosí, jak by to něco nebylo. A myslím, že to platí vlastně ve všech třech pohybech. Takže a tím se jako vracím na začátek k té otázce toho, jestli vlastně je schopen myslet tu historičnost Patočka, nebo jestli vlastně to je vůbec jako historický. Ono to právě totiž jako historický nakonec není, že? Nebo není to prostě konkrétní, když to možná je. Prostě je to skutečně tak, že to bylo vlastně zajímavé, že v jednom posudku Sandra Lehmann psala vlastně proti tomu, jak já se snažím říct, že ty pohyby existence jsou jako to u Patočky fajn, tak ona vlastně docela, myslím, jako správně řekla, že vlastně že ta koncepce je jakoby tím víc abstraktnější, čím se snaží být jakoby konkrétnější. Právě protože vlastně ona popisuje ty struktury, že? To je prostě jenom celý strašně takový jako strukturní. Celý to ještě visí na těch jako 3 časových extazích, což není vlastně prostě jako 3 a tak. To vlastně celý jako velmi abstraktní, protože to je právě skutečně vlastně hodně v té linii toho promýšlení podmínek možností vlastně vystavit nějaké struktury a vlastně není tam vlastně tam jakoby hodně chybí ta konfrontace jakoby s tím jevícím se, jako odkud by se začalo vlastně přemýšlet. Nebo když to řekne prostě ještě jinak, tak prostě Patočka vlastně hodně přejímá tu Heideggerovu koncepci Geštelu, která je jako překvapivě vlastně jako dodnes vlivná i jako současné filozofii techniky, byť často jako to vůči čemu se vlastně ty autoři vymezují. A oni právě vlastně, že říkají, že to, co chybí u toho Heideggera, když uvažuje o technice, a u Patočky by to bylo ještě horší, že on technice téměř vůbec neuvažuje. Je vlastně je to, že by se konfrontoval s těmi skutečnými technologiemi, s nimiž máme co dočinit. Vlastně je to přesně jako ten případ toho, že je to vlastně jako velmi abstraktní úvaha, která zachycuje něco jako velmi podstatného pro to, co se děje. Ale zároveň ona neumožní, teď mám na mysli Heideggera, ta jeho analýza techniky vlastně nám neumožní něco s tím smysluplně dělat, protože se vlastně velmi cíleně a jako zásadově snaží vůbec si nějak nezadat s těmi konkrétními technikami a technologiemi, s nimiž máme co učinit. A vlastně ta možnost udělat něco jinak, otevřít nějaké možnosti, vlastně tam musí přijít jako úplně od jiných. Tam není cesta, prostě to je jako uzavřený pole. Prostě podobně jako my při u Patočky, prostě máme tady třetí pohyb, jehož konkrétní náplň je velmi nejasná. To se vlastně snažím se ukazovat, vlastně, že není jasný, co teda. Kdo to má dělat, jak to má dělat, co má dělat, vlastně jako nic z toho není jasný. To otevírá to možnost, každý si z toho vlastně může vzít trochu, co se mu bude jako líbit, že prostě tam není konklece v tom žádný. Myslím, že to je v této linii. Tak. No a pak ještě tam byly nějaký dvě poznámky mezi tím, ale
když to hodně zjednodušil, tak ten obrat mediality je vlastně jakási repríza toho, že filozofie uvažuje o podmínkách možností. Médium je určitá podmínka možností. Teď je jedno vše. A na tom pojmu média ale bylo lze ukázat složitější vztah mezi tím médiem a tím, co to médium zprostředkovává, protože za A. Médium se tradičně definitoricky vyznačuje tím, že je neviditelné. To znamená, že jenom v určitých okamžicích o sobě dává vědět jakožto médium. A třeba celá jedna část filosofie, třeba umění, estetiky, pracuje s tím, že právě tohle je to, co dělá umění ve 20. století. Že zviditelňuje svá média. A teď s tím ale taky souvisí ten pojem materiality, protože ten je zrádný. Lepší by bylo vycházet z toho, že zkušenost materiálna máme tehdy, když pociťujeme rezistenci. V okamžiku, kdy médium rezistuje svému zprůhlednění, tak máme vlastně cosi, co lze nazvat fenoménem určitý materiality, neprostupnosti, neprůhlednosti, netransparence a tak dále. A vlastně tohle je základem pro to, čemu říkáme materiálno, ne nějaká hmota, kterou beru dolů. Tohle jsou, myslím, motivy, které potom hrajou velkou roli. Tam vlastně u těch pohybů to je něco, co skutečně lze označit jako podmínka možnostní existence, řekněme teda autentický a evropský, ale zároveň je to něco, co my nevidíme a vlastně v jednom rozsvětlení by se dalo nalézt to, jak rezistují vůči svým transparentní, to si myslím, že no a tohle potom organicky si musím přemýšlet o té objektově orientované filozofie, takže musíme si zvyknout na to, že objekt je něco jiného, to prostě není tak jednoduchá věc a ta materialita reálná a tak dále, ale to už je všechno, co nějaký předpřipraveností reflexy na média.
So the book is called None So Fit to Break the Chains. That's my slightly strange decision to name a book about Marx with a quotation from someone completely different. The quotation is from the Irish socialist James Connolly, who wrote, the full quote is, "There are none so fitted to break the chains as those that wear them, none so well equipped to know what is a fetter." And the thrust of the book really is to attempt to defend and develop that idea as an interpretation of Marx, as an argument that that idea is key to Marx's own work, and as a principle in its own right. So the idea that there are none so fit to break their chains as those that wear them, emancipation must be and can only be self-emancipation, and there are none so fit to know what is a fetter, what is a constraint, that is the capacity to both criticize existing society and to found a new one, lies with those with whom it most oppresses. See, I can't even speak English today, sorry. So I argue that this is a principle that foregrounding this principle helps understand a great deal of what Marx says, I think. I think you might go so far as to say you don't really understand Marx if you don't understand that one of his projects from the very beginning is a notion of working class self-emancipation, and that his concepts are to be understood in light of that. I'll say a little bit more about some of those concepts later. But I also think that's something relevant to contemporary politics. There's a line I use, I realized I use it twice in the book by accident. And it feels a bit dated now in the times of coronavirus, but when I was really making the final edits to the book, I was looking at the Guardian website. This is a liberal newspaper from the UK, and the banner headline at the top was, "Dear Bill Gates, please lead us in the fight against climate change." And I couldn't get this out of my head because I thought this was an exact demonstration of what this book is not about. It's not about asking Bill Gates to lead us in the fight against climate change. It's about a process by which we don't look to leaders from outside, but we think about what it means to emancipate ourselves, or what it might mean for people to emancipate themselves, and to think systematically through what that means on a practical and a theoretical level. So what I want to try and do, I don't know if I'll be able to do it all, and talk a little bit about the book, and talk a little bit about the context of writing the book, because I think that's important, and even if you don't, and end with maybe a few lines of self-criticism, because as I'll say in a minute, this is some of this work, although I'm very glad that people enjoy it, is already things I've been thinking through a little bit differently. So part of the argument that I want to make, or part of the central thrust of the book, is that Marx is a thinker of freedom. The first chapter is called Prometheus plus Spartacus, and takes its name from a line by the American socialist Hal Draper, who argued that Prometheus plus Spartacus equals the starting point of Marxism. We know, by the way, that Marx greatly admired both of these historical figures. There are these interesting family documents where he says Spartacus is his most admired historical figure, and I think Aeschylus is his favorite playwright because of Prometheus. Those two figures, Prometheus and Spartacus, I can kind of give you a sense of the two dimensions in which Marx sees freedom as being realized. On the one hand, realized in our relationship with nature, and on the other, in our political relationships with others. So central to Marx's criticism of capitalism is that while it had expanded the potential for our relationship with nature, it had also created social relations that made freedom in that relationship impossible. And it was only through a transformation of both that it was possible to achieve some kind of real freedom. So the alternative that he holds out is a society based on self-management that he called communism, based on democratic structures in which people are able to direct and control their own activity. He believed that such a society was possible, but only on the basis of some kind of revolutionary transformation of both social relations and consciousness. In that respect, at least, I don't think my book is particularly original. I know in many quarters it is somehow controversial to talk about Marx as a philosopher of freedom. I think enough has been written to show that I think that he is a philosopher of freedom, and if all my book was doing was arguing that, I wouldn't have very much to add. So my book focuses really on the second step of that argument, the step of the argument that says this society that permits free activity itself can only be built on the basis of free activity. That is to say, emancipation must be self-emancipation, Prometheus and Spartacus must emancipate themselves. And so as I said, really, the book is an attempt to systematically think through what that means. I think that this approach influenced Marx's, or I think this commitment rather, influenced Marx's approach as an activist, but also as what we would now maybe call a socially engaged critical theorist. It affected how he thought about his own role as a theorist within social movements, within worker struggles. And I take seriously the idea that taking seriously self-emancipation means thinking about the relationship between theory and practice and one's role as theorists within those movements. So, for example, I dedicate a chapter to considering the question of whether it is possible for Marx to have a theory of history, historical materialism, and be a political activist. This is a kind of old debate in many ways, but I think it remains an important one. I won't talk about that chapter in great detail today, but what I argue there is that the kinds of generalizations and predictions that are characteristic of historical materialism make sense as strategic claims, as claims to help us understand and change the world, not to simply predict the inevitability of communism or to assume a degree of false confidence in the future. And I also think that this is a guiding thread behind his criticism of the utopians and his idea of what it meant or what was necessary in describing an alternative, or rather his reticence in describing an alternative to communism. I also focus on what I consider the two main concepts with which he criticized capitalism, exploitation and alienation. I argue that both are best understood in terms of freedom, and neither require, as it were, a substantive alternative to which capitalism fails to live up, rather that it's possible to criticize capitalism on the basis of its failure to permit that kind of freedom without necessarily committing ourselves to a very specific alternative. And then my final two chapters turn to more practical questions. I talk about Marx's idea of politics, the role of demands and the role of the state, the role of organizations to a certain extent there. And I finally end with an examination of a few different attempts to make the principle of self-emancipation more concrete. I'm going to come back to those two ideas a little bit towards the end in my self-criticism section, but before I go into a little bit more detail about some of these other themes, let me say a little bit about the context of the book. So this began as a PhD project pretty much exactly 10 years ago in 2010. I completed that PhD in 2014. I substantially revised that at the beginning of 2016, and then various kind of unavoidable delays meant that it was finally published last year with some revisions. I'm not just telling you that out of kind of biographical detail, but if you want more biographical detail, we can talk later. But the reason I say this is because at the beginning of this process, when I started writing the PhD, I was an activist in a socialist organization. I still am, but I was an activist in a different socialist organization. The first years of the PhD were marked, first of all, by the protests against the increase of tuition fees in Britain that became quite a serious and sustained campaign that took over my life for a bit. And then what became known as the Arab Spring, the revolutions in Egypt, especially as a kind of inspirational example of what revolutions could look like, and then followed by a rather depressing end. I began the PhD as a project about Marx's ethics. It wasn't really about self-emancipation. The concept of self-emancipation kind of snuck up on me because I kept finding that as an activist, or in these activist circles in which I was operating, this concept was taken for granted. This idea, the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class themselves, was almost dogma. And yet you read academic texts on Marx and it kind of doesn't come up. And I felt like understanding that that's what Marx was about really did help you understand certain concepts in what he was doing. Another thing that, however, happened in that period, or rather in 2013, was that the organization that I was a part of kind of fell apart, and I ended up leaving that organization. Now, the reasons for that were to do with a failure to handle a case of sexual assault, which is sadly too common a story, but the reason I bring it up is because I think that in the process of both doing the PhD and then later revising the book, I kind of went from feeling like I had a secure core of orthodoxy to defend, to doubting a great deal of what I thought I believed. And when I read the book back in preparation for this, I thought I can kind of still see that I still I'm sometimes in one mode and sometimes in the other mode, and I'm sometimes overcorrecting my doubts in one direction or another. So that's one reason why I wanted to talk about the context of the writing. The other is a very specific one, which is that a review of the book was published yesterday by a good friend of mine, Paul Reichstad, and he points out how I don't really go into concrete details about the different forms of organization that are necessary. I think the fact that I had gone from being in one organization that took one structural form, formed another organization, then the day that I was packing boxes to move to Prague, something happened that I thought was unimaginable, which was Jeremy Corbyn being elected leader of the Labour Party. And then when I was making the final edits, I was running into an election in which Jeremy Corbyn was about to be destroyed. It means that I really don't know anything anymore about what forms of organisation are necessary beyond the absolute basic. So I suspect that's why in the end I don't say very much about it. But as I said, the book is not about those experiences, but I think you don't fully understand some of the things I'm going through in the book if you don't know a little bit about those experiences. So I want to focus in on, I think, maybe if I have time, 3 core concepts in the book before I say a few things about, by way of self-criticism. The first is the idea of self-emancipation itself, or the idea of revolutionary practice that it seems to be involved in it. So Petter kind of already talked about it. Marx gives us a certain kind of paradox here. We are products of our circumstances. Being determines consciousness, famously. We are constrained by our existing social relationships, and our existing social relationships are ones of unfreedom. They are ones of domination. It is possible, desirable, necessary, to form an alternative society in which we do realize relationships of freedom, relationships of democratic self-management, relationships in which we are in control of things. And the only way we can get there is through free action, through self-emancipation. Now that unfortunately seems like a pretty difficult situation to be in, right? If we are completely unfree, how do we get to that freedom? Really, that's the core of what I discuss in the second chapter of the book. The solution, I think, in Marx at least, is to be found in the third thesis on Feuerbach, which reads as follows. I'll just read the whole thing. The materialist doctrine concerning the changes of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and that it is essential to educate the educator himself. This doctrine must therefore divide society into 2 parts, one of which is superior to society. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-changing can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. So it's very condensed, but there's 2 things going on here. One is a rejection of the idea that you can transform consciousness from outside, that you can rely on some great leader, some great educator to come and reform the conditions so that everyone can improve. And the other is, therefore, the only alternative is consciousness of a process of self-transformation. And I argue, and I don't think, again, this is particularly controversial, Marx finds this example in the struggles of workers. There's a very famous passage in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, which Marx observes, specifically writing about French workers in Paris, that when they organize together, they acquire a new need. The need for society, and what appears as a means has become an end. This, I think, is a way of understanding struggles of workers in the present as prefigurative, as anticipating alternative forms of society, and that's where the direction my work has gone in since. I think Petra and I were talking a few weeks ago, how is it that I ended up writing about prefigurative politics from writing about Marx? Well, that's it, and that's what I'm currently working on. I think that that's an important insight, that these struggles, that the fact that workers are forced to organize for their interests creates this new need for society, or these new alternative forms of structures and relationships which can kind of be the embryo of a new society. I think that's a vital insight, but I also want in your book, maybe more than others, to emphasize the gap. There is a huge gap there. there's a line in the Grundrisse. Marx says, the hunger satisfied by a knife and fork is still hunger, but it's completely different from the hunger satisfied by eating raw meat. And if he can say that, then he has to also say that the struggles of workers now are at least somewhat different from the communism that he anticipates in the future. There is a gap, and in a way it's in that gap that my book is trying to operate. It's trying to think about what kind of principles, what kinds of structures, what kinds of theory is necessary to both recognize that gap and move from that gap to the future desired alternative. Part of that means there's uncertainty, there's unevenness, and the question becomes how to develop and think about those relationships. And in one very important sense, I think this is about theory, not just practice. This is about how we do theory in ways that allow for these processes to develop themselves and be directed by people themselves. And the one example I will talk about briefly, which is what I talk about in chapter 4, I think, is the question of utopianism and Marx's criticism of the utopian socialists. Marx has this strange honor of being described as simultaneously too utopian and not utopian enough. And somehow the Soviet Union is the fault of both of those things in people's interpretations. On the one hand, Marx is a kind of classically utopian thinker who is willing to trample on the rights of individuals to build a utopian society. On the other hand, he's not utopian enough because he doesn't really tell us what communism should look like. And depending on who you read, really all the bad things of communism can be traced back to one or other of those things depending on your particular bias. I think one of the things that I think is distinctive about my book is that I believe Marx was right to be wary of, as he puts it at one point, writing recipes for the cookshops of the future, or drawing blueprints of what society should look like. It's increasingly common, I think, among Marxists and among socialists to say, no, we need to be able to say what our alternative is. We need to be able to give a model, and it's a failure to not be able to give a model. I make the case in that chapter that I think actually there were good reasons for Marx rejecting that, and I think those are still good reasons. I think Marx had two reasons for being suspicious of these kinds of visions of the future. One is, I think, more familiar, traditionally known, which you might say is epistemic. It's about our ability to know the future. Again, if being determines consciousness, then we ought to be aware of the limits of our ability to anticipate and imagine the future, the way in which it, in fact, reflects our existing world, the fact that our consciousness is fundamentally limited in various ways. But equally, I think, and I think you see this if you really read the people Marx is criticizing and the reasons he gives for criticizing them, there is also something, I think, about the methodology of utopianism. The idea that it is a special task of theory, of philosophy, of some people to come up with a vision of the future and hand it down to the masses, to describe what the future will look like and to tell people to build it. Tell the people who are to live in it, who are to inhabit it, how to build it. Or not even how to build it, it's to build it. I think that Marx is sensitive to the kind of elitist moment, the idea that the separation involved in delegating a task of designing society to a particular group of people, and then merely allowing the masses to build. In the book, I make a comparison between what in contemporary political philosophy is known as ideal theory and utopianism. So ideal theory, this is a comparison that I know not everyone finds convincing, but I think is useful. Ideal theory starts from the principle that political philosophy only really makes sense in light of the design of ideals. The task of political philosophy is to design ideals, and political debate, political activity, real politics happens in light of or happens after those ideals are developed. I think there's a very real sense in which what that does is institutionalize a division of labor between those who design society and those who live in it. And I think Marx was particularly sensitive to that. I think actually the attitude of Marx to this is summarized very nicely by this quotation from Engels, which is very long, but I really do think it's worth it. So this is from the Origins of the Family. So he's specifically talking about sexual relations, but I see no reason to not apply this to other aspects. What we can now conjecture about the way in which social relations will be ordered after the impending overthrow of capitalist production is mainly of a negative character, limited for the most part to what will disappear. But what will there be new? That will be answered when a new generation has grown up, a generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power, a generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man from any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of economic consequences. When these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody today thinks they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. And although I think there's something a bit depressing, or a bit kind of cutting off about that idea, right? I think it's nice to think that we can speculate. I think it's actually very important to acknowledge that it isn't, that by all means we can speculate, but to see, as it were, the design of the future as a central task of the present is to get something the wrong way round about this relationship. And I think that commitment, or that flows from Marx's commitment to self-emancipation, and only really makes sense in light of it. So of course that means that it's possible to restrict our criticisms to this negative character, right? If it was impossible, then Marx would just be wrong. So I do spend a bit of time in the chapter at least defending the idea that it is possible, which is an idea that comes, well, an idea in which I'm quite heavily influenced by my PhD supervisor, Fabian Freienhagen, his writings about Adorno, where he emphasizes, or he argues at least, that it's perfectly possible and perfectly coherent to talk about bad things, criticize bad things, without necessarily being committed or even knowing what your good alternative is. And I think that that's actually an extremely important thing for social movements today to be able to defend. That it is possible to criticize and condemn without being forced onto the defensive, as it were, instantly having to say, well, what is your alternative? That's not to say, by the way, that we can't talk about the future. There's a throwaway line in the book about maybe talking about it at the level of fiction is better than doing it at the level of theory. And I was reminded of this when I recently read this book by Holly Jean Buck called After Geoengineering, which is about geoengineering, which you think is something totally nothing to do with what I'm writing about. But what I thought was really striking is the way she proceeds with this book is accompanying each of her analyses is a little story, a piece of fiction, imagining a future. Actually, I was thinking reading that's a lot better, a lot more effective way of thinking about the future than thinking that it's something we should do at the level of political theory and political analysis. And similarly, I think it's important to say that social movements themselves throw up many, many different alternatives, many, many different ideas about the future. And therefore, I think the task of, as it were, someone who believes what Marx believes what I believe, is not to think about what the future would be in isolation, but to engage with those movements and help draw out and develop what those alternatives, what those implicit alternatives might be. And I do that, I mention in the book the ideas of Ruth Levitas, which I think are particularly useful, who talks about the architectural and archaeological modes of utopia, in which I like this idea of, rather than, as it were, writing recipes for the cookshops of the future or building palaces in the sky or whatever metaphor you like, it's more like digging up these bits and seeing how we might put them together and revising them as we go. Okay, I will jump ahead because I have no idea how long I've been talking and I think it's too long. But jump ahead to a few things about self-criticism, by way of which I will maybe say one or two more things about it. One place where I think my book could say more is about the idea of history. I have a whole chapter on the theory of history, but I realized there's not very much history in it. And that's because I'm interested in defending the idea that historical materialism as a predictive theory, as a theory that makes generalizations about human behavior, as a scientific theory of a certain kind, is compatible with the principle of self-emancipation, with the idea that this can be incorporated into a project of self-emancipation rather than being, as it were, an alternative to it, sort of a historical determinism. But in the process, I kind of talk more about science than I do about history. One of the ways in which I think I forget about this is I kind of write sometimes as if everything has to already start again. Like every movement has to start completely from scratch and we can never learn from history. And I think there's a way in which that's true, because it doesn't matter how much Lenin you read, you're not Lenin. Or it doesn't matter how much you read about the Commune, we don't know what it was like. But in another sense, I think if I was to write more, I would try and think about how it is that movements can reincorporate ideas of history and historical experience more systematically within themselves, within these processes that I talk about. The second is, I think I don't talk enough about the emotional or affective side of the ethics I write about. The final chapter, I do talk about ethics in maybe the traditional sense of principles of action, of what you should do and how we might understand ourselves. But I put that largely in terms of codified rules, rather than what I actually am now more interested in, which is what you might call virtues, of the kinds of affects and features of character that are necessary. I think I do mention some of those in the book. Hope is important, trust is important, confidence in the capacity of others to learn and develop is important. But I would have liked to have written more about that, or at least maybe I'll think about writing that again. The last thing that I think is missing, or that is an omission, is the idea of nature. And I think in the chapter, especially where I write about human nature, I'm at pains to argue that Marx doesn't have an overly substantive, an overly biologist, an overly kind of restrictive idea of human nature. But again, in the course of that, I think I forgot about, the fact that we are natural. And again, some of the work that Petra and I are now working on with Catherine Malibu as well, thinking about the natural and the biological and the freedom in a way, freedom in nature. I think, I suppose all I'm saying really is I would have liked to have read that, like to have been doing that before I published the book, not after. And my final comment by way of self-criticism is that I think there's a tension running right through the book that I thought when I was reading it yesterday between what you might call the formal and the substantive, both in terms of concepts of communism, of human nature, of freedom, of emancipation. I think I want to say on the one hand that Marx can criticize capitalism formally without worrying about substantive ideas of the good life, of ethical values. Capitalism fails because it's an unfree society. It's a society that fails to allow us to achieve our potential, whatever that potential is. And Marx is able to criticize on that basis without then saying, well, this is what our potential is. We should live like this. That said, I think again and again, I think I find myself coming back to this idea that, well, actually, communism will involve some substantive values. It's not enough to just say freedom. We might need to think a little bit more about, even if it's not our business, right? As Engels says, it's none of his business, it's their business. And maybe it will be none of our business, but it's got to be someone's business one day. And I think that tension is there right through, where I sometimes want to kind of fall back defensively and say, no, we can just criticize formally, and then I sometimes want to say, but we can have these substantive values come later. Maybe I'll say in my defense, I think that might be Marx's tension as well, not just mine. And so I want to finish actually with a quotation from Darren Webb, who wrote a book about Marx and utopianism, which is criminally underrated and really hard to find. If you can find a copy, I strongly recommend it. So Darren Webb says that Marx's problems were those of generating radical hope without foreclosing the future, of capturing the spirit of revolution whilst remaining faithful to the principles of proletarian self-emancipation and self-determination. So important did Marx consider these problems that resolving them became his own political and theoretical project. So that's what Webb says, and I will only add that I agree that that was Marx's theoretical and political project, and I believe it still should be ours today.
I have to thank you for your invitation. I really enjoyed reading the book. It made me nostalgic because it reminded me of the things which I tried to tackle 40 years ago when I was studying my first year of Marxist-Leninist philosophy in Berlin. And I was trying to get out of official Marxism, but from within. So I was trying to, and I think we can use the idea of one English, or rather British, historian, expert on communism. He wrote the history of communism, and he said at the very beginning of the book, his name is David Priestley, he said that there are several Marxes. And there is romantic Marx, especially his early period, where you feel that he is really influenced by German romanticism, by the realization of the full potential of humanity. There is libertarian Marx, which I think is a little bit after that, or merges with the romantic Marx a little bit, which is your Marx, I think. And then is a technocratic Marx, which prevailed in the mainstream of social democratic movements. He didn't mention that, but he has a passage when he explains that he's trying to construct his reading of Marx and Marxism against the mainstream reading, which emerged at the end of the 19th century, more or less, at the turn of the 19th century, and which prevailed in both radical wing of social democracy, from which then became Bolshevism, and the less radical wing, especially German social democracy. And he links it to two names, Plekhanov and Kautsky. And that was the form of Marxism, which became then official, basically. It was taken over more or less by Lenin. It's a much more complex story, as you know, but taken over by Lenin, and Stalin reworked that, and basically in the 80s or 70s, when we were taught the official Marxist philosophy in this country, we were taught this version. So basically, and we were, on top of that, we were living in a sort of bad technocratic Marxist regime. Bad, because it didn't really function properly. But it was based on the technocratic idea that you have the knowledge, you have to cultivate the knowledge of the world, of the objective world, the laws of movement of the world, including social work, including the laws of movement of history, on which then you build your political theory, and then, of course, the regime which is supposedly Marxist. And of course, we were, and instead of building a society of emancipated people, it actually constructed another kind of domination, different from capitalist domination, but nevertheless domination. So that was my situation in, let's say, 1980, 81, when I was a first-year student of philosophy in Berlin. And so I was trying to find out whether I could find in Marx or Lenin a different Marx from technocratic. So I didn't use that terminology, which I read much later on with Priestley. But that was what I was doing, basically trying to, and I was finding the passages you basically refer to in your book. Especially I was, and I wrote several papers about the Marx of the mid-40s, which I think is a very interesting period. Mid-40s, I mean 1840s, 45. The thesis of Feuerbach, 45. German ideology. For me, it was the basic text. And in retrospect, I think what's interesting in those texts is that he's in the period of making what he and Engels later on called that maybe they are already after the period, when they stood Hegel from the head on the left. So he's moving from he's as a young Hegelian, as a leftist young Hegelian, he has moved to materialism. But at the same time, he's very critical of materialism, certain kind of materialism, which he called crude materialism. Czech translation is translated to vulgar materialism, which is too mechanistic. Right? So the thesis of Feuerbach, half of the text is basically trying to find a third way between Hegelian idealism and Feuerbachian too crude materialism. Some sort of middle, not middle position, but overcome those two alternatives and construct something different, something which, and why I think it was an important moment for me, and in those debates you are basically rehearsing a little bit in the book, is that he doesn't want to switch from the Hegelian idealism right away to materialist, very objectivist, scientistic position. Yes, we have to abandon idealism and the idea that ideas somehow govern the world, and if they change the ideas, then we can change the world. This is wrong. We have at first to take knowledge of reality, of objective reality, and only on that basis we can construct a political alternative to capitalism. But at the same time, he doesn't want to end up in extreme determinism. Now, what happened to this mainstream version of Marxism? Let's call it Orthodox Marxism. Not, we can stay agnostic which Marx was the true Marx, technocratic, libertarian, romantic. We can put it away for a while. It's simply Orthodox Marxism in the sense that it prevailed in important parts of the working class movement. So Orthodox Marxism actually ended up in a very, very deterministic position. It was actually more complex in the first years, or the first month of the Bolshevik Revolution, because there you see a weird combination of extreme voluntarism and extreme determinism. But in retrospect, and especially in the Stalinist version of Leninism, it ended up in a very deterministic version, which had serious consequences, organizational consequences. Now I come to that. What I think to the point of the book, which is the most important, that the way you define the relationship between theory and practice entails the organizational forms of your movement. Dan doesn't say that directly, but I think it might be implied in some of the passages of this book. And okay, what what I think is important, and what was our way to think about it in my little circle in Brno 40 years ago, was to change the basic question which they taught us is the basic question of Marxism, according to Engels' piece about Ludwig Feuerbach and how is it, the denouement of the German classical philosophy, where Engels says the basic question, philosophical question, is what's first, matter or spirit? Okay? And so it's a, you know, if you read German ideology or thesis on Feuerbach, you find out that it's not really, maybe not really the basic question. Basic question is the relationship between theory and practice. For the Marx of the mid-40s, that at least was our position. So we began to think about that. And then we went back to ask the question, okay, if we put away the problem of matter and spirit as a sort of trivial or not really inspiring problem, so we are not anymore interested in the way, or we are not anymore interested in how Marx and Engels put Hegel from the head to the left, from the spirit to the matter. But we are more interested in what's the difference between Hegel's conception of the relationship between theory and practice and Marx. And what we find out was the following. And of course I will be very schematic, so those who know Hegel, please don't kill me. But I suggest we can encapsulate the Hegel's conception of the relationship between theory and practice by one very famous sentence. Who knows that sentence? Easy. No. The all of the Minerva rises at the dusk. Right? The whole of Minerva rises at the dusk. What does it mean? That means that the knowledge, philosophy, reflection, which defines the meaning of reality, the essence of reality, starts after the action has ended. After the history has done its work, only then can come Hegel and define the meaning of the history as something which has passed. So the end of the history precedes the final philosophy of the spirit, or the end of the history precedes the theory of history. It cannot be otherwise, according to Hegel. Right? Napoleon was the guy who ended history, according to some interpretations of Hegel. But Napoleon didn't know what he was doing. Only Hegel knew what Napoleon was. Right? So we have two kinds of people. We have those who know and those who do. So in the relationship between theory and practice, you also have a relationship between two classes of people. One class are people who don't have money and don't have any means for their livelihood, and they have to work. They cannot think that they have to work, because otherwise they would starve. The other class of the people are people who have free time because they have money. And they can think about reality and they can construct philosophical theories. Now, if Hegel was right, I will go to Marx. So what's the difference between Hegel's conception of the relationship between theory and practice and Marx's? It's very simple. It's very simple if you take this orthodox mainstream Marxist position. In that sense, it's a very simple answer. He simply doesn't buy Hegel's idea that the right philosophy has to come only after the history was ended. He says the opposite. He says, I am laying down the true philosophy, the true meaning of the human history, before the end of that history. Okay? So that's the major difference. He basically rejects the Hegelian separation between theory and practice. Now, this is the mainstream. Okay, what's the implication of that? The implication is that those who have free time what's the implication of this new situation for them? For the relationship between those who know and those who do. The implication is that the leaders of the society have to be those who know. Because they know where history is heading, as Marx knew, so they can show the way. They say, in order to accelerate the history, which is functioning more or less according to its law, to its, as he called it, natural historical laws. We have to know the laws, we know where history is heading, and so those people who are able to do that, they are the most important people. They will enlighten the others, they will enlighten the working class. And they will form the movement. There will be a merger between, or fusion, or synthesis rather, between theory and practice in the revolutionary movement. Now, you can read Dan's books as a sort of, as a text which casts doubts about this version of Marx. I endorse the first self-criticism of yours, because I think the problem of the reader is that you cannot really gauge the organizational consequences, and you also, and I think that might be a more serious problem, you also avoid the question of the two classes. Because that would lead you, and you are quite vague. For Marx, it was clear. It was not the movement and organizers or theorists, but for Marx, it was the working class people, real force or segment of the society, and theorists who are from the bourgeois class. There is in the Communist Manifesto, there is one sentence when implicitly they acknowledge that. They say that some members of the bourgeois class split at one moment from the bourgeoisie and joined the proletariat. So it's clear that they talk about themselves, Engels and Marx, because sociologically speaking, there's no doubt about that. We belong to the bourgeois class. You a little bit, not a little bit, you basically, this is your elephant in the room. Not a little bit, you basically avoid the whole question. And with that you also avoid 150 years which passed from Marx analysis, which I think is criminal. Because then you cannot really transfer what Marx says about the movement. Today, you don't have the industrial proletariat which Marx had before his time. You don't have proletariat which is suffering. So segments of the proletariat are really revolutionary. They really want to smash the bourgeois system. You don't have in Britain the last elections were the opposite. The working class people voted for Johnson and schematizing. People like us, many people like us, little bourgeois, petty bourgeois intellectuals, voted for Corbyn, right? So you don't, it's completely different. We have to ask those questions. How is it, and why is it, that the working class in the last 40, 50 years lost its revolutionary potential. It's rather new middle class, basically we, who are playing these revolutionary ideas. It's basically from 68, the situation is this, from the 68, and some more reflective people of the Western left were talking about that a long time ago. For instance, André Gaulle was saying that. He was saying this is the problem, because working class is not revolutionary anymore. The most revolutionary segment of today's society, the 70s and 80s, is basically new middle class. Now, the last point of mine is maybe most serious, even more serious than this. I go back to what we were thinking about 40 years ago in my little circle in Brno. We didn't get too much further, basically. I stopped here. At that time I wrote the master degree thesis about philosophy of praxis, which was basically Labriolas term, tried to avoid the term of Marxism, philosophy of praxis and Jean-Paul Sartre. And then I left Marxism, because I simply felt that it's not really, empirically speaking, all too many changes have happened between Marx and between Marx time and 1980 in order to be able, I simply thought, and Marx became in my eyes somebody like Hegel or John Stuart Mill or Max Weber, big figure with whom I still read a lot, but I stopped being Marxist in the religious sense of the term, believing that Marx actually, grasped something important which we all should accept in our political orientation. Anyway, a long time ago, actually when I was writing my last book, a long time after that, so 30 years after that, 10 years ago, I was rereading some of Marx, especially the Marx of the mid-1840s, whom I like so much. And I have a friend who used to be anarchist, and I was talking about libertarian Marx and saying to that friend, it's basically something what you said, that because I was trying in my book, I was trying to elaborate on a theory of emancipation and self-emancipation. And I was critical of what in the book is called Leninist Hegelianism, I think I call it in the book, which is this idea that you have determinism which drives history, and then of course you can accelerate history, and this conception of history of course gives power and justification of the authority for the intellectuals. Basically, and gives justification also to build the Communist Party, very centralized Communist Party, where which are actually the priests of the revolution. Those are those who know. And they should enlighten the masses and lead the masses. So I was critical of that, and my anarchist or ex-anarchist friend told me, but you should then read what was going on during the First International. You don't have to read Marx, actually. You read Bakunin or some Proudhonians from France. So I read several books about that, and I actually found out that some of those passages you quote, for instance, which have always been given as example that Marx was not this kind of orthodox determinist Marxist, but he was actually open to self-government and self-management of the workers and so on and so forth. If you want to have a full systematic statement of self-managed socialism, you read Bakunin, you don't read Marx. And especially you read the struggles between Bakuninians and Marx and Engels in the First International. And this will be the last critical point, and my last point, because I'm talking too early. I think you cannot, what I really was exasperated about, some parts I really liked, but some points I was really exasperated. You read Marx as a sort of ahistorical political theory, or ethical theory. Something which, like the Jews were reading the Torah as ahistorical, eternal truth. So you are trying to, of course, the Jews knew that there are many interpretations and there is an infinite possible proliferation of interpretation, but they believe that all those interpretations are, driving or directing to this truth, which will be always hidden to them, but they somehow feel that the Torah is so. Especially somebody like Marx, who don't give a damn about theory separated from practice. I don't think it's really worth reading Marx in this way. You have to read Marx. For instance, what he wrote in Civil War in France. You have to read what he wrote there in the context of the First International and the struggles and debates. Right? And then you understand that those are the passages you refer to are concessions, actually, that Marx was against. He was against. His inclination was, not the inclination, but the infamous letter to the German Social Democrats, when he said, well, maybe it's not bad if Bismarck is controlling France before the war. Okay? Maybe. The French internationalists were writing a manifesto against the war. This is not our war, this is the bourgeois war. Marx was reading a secret letter to the German Social Democrats saying, well, it's not that bad, because Bismarck will centralize France as Russian state is centralized. And it will be better for our movement because we actually think that the productive forces are getting concentrated and centralized and they have to be socialized by the state. So for us it's good if Bismarck builds centralized state. Within several months, he himself probably, I don't have any sophisticated theory about his change of mind. But probably, the most probable thing is that he got really, he got taken by what was going on. So I don't think he was pretending something. He really somehow began to understand that something like self-emancipation is possible. Because until that point, and this will be my last point, until that point, he was against it. Bakunin and Prudhomians, they were saying the working class should emancipate itself. It shouldn't be emancipated by you, Engels and Marx, sitting in London in the General Council and dictating us what we should do. And there were concrete organizational struggles. First struggle was Marx and Engels were saying workers in each country should build their own political parties to compete for political power with the bourgeoisie. Prudhomians, who prevailed in France and in Italy, were saying the opposite. They were saying, no. We don't need to play this bourgeois game of the bourgeois parliaments. We organize ourselves in cooperatives and mutualities, and we build an alternative society along basically the Prudhomian lines. I'm not saying that they were wrong and Marx was right or vice versa, but that was the thing. And the argument was exactly this. You are bourgeois. You are bourgeois intellectual who try to impose upon us your theory of history. But we know, and we had it in the banner of the First International, that the working class people have to emancipate themselves. So at one point, for instance, Bakunin exited the Alliance International, I think it was in 72 or 73, saying, I'm bourgeois. You know, I don't belong, I am diffused with my heart, but I'm bourgeois, I cannot be. And I don't want to be your leader. And Bakunin had a very interesting, of course, from my courses in the early 80s, it was clear that there was a scientific version of revolutionary struggle, which was on the side of Marx, and later on Lenin. And then there was this voluntaristic version, right? Voluntaristic version, which was Bakunin. And I think it's true, if you read some of the texts, but you have to read both Marx and Bakunin, because you cannot really understand Marx, you know, pick up what Marx wrote in 65 and then 67 and then 71 and trying to construct some sort of abstract theory of Marx, of emancipation. I don't really believe in that. I think you have to read what his formulation, how he fought Bakunin, and Bakunin fought back. And Bakunin had one argument which is coming back time and again, that he's saying, if the movement which you defend, if the movement will be organized in the way you want, namely as a political party which will be centralized, which will have one theory, maybe your or Marxist theory, and if this movement really takes up the state, you will establish the dictatorship of those who knew over the working class. Basically, that was Bakunin's prediction, which was right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for all of the comments. I really do appreciate it, and I appreciate doing it in English at short notice as well. Okay, where to begin? So, let me start with anarchism. I think that my relative ignorance of those debates, I think, is an entirely fair criticism. It's a criticism actually that a friend of mine also made of the book, and I think it's fair to a degree, and I think it connects to some of the things I said at the beginning, which is sort of the nature of my political education. And I suppose that would be maybe my first point to maybe defend myself a little bit, is to say that, you know, there is an audience for this book, right? And the audience is the people who maybe do have a tendency to read Marx in a Talmudic kind of way, shall we say? And that's a tendency that I'm aware that I'm prone to as well. So I will accept that. Although I will say that I do in fact talk in the book about, for example, the arguments about taking state power, and I don't go into nearly as much detail as I ought to. That's absolutely true, but I do in fact, I think, identify that as an important element of Marxist thought, where I think the idea of self-emancipation, which again I don't agree is only something borrowed from the anarchists, I think is there much earlier in Marx, but is where that is generative of a number of difficulties and tensions, which I should have gone into more, wish I had gone into more. But I do also think it's actually quite important, because I think that one of the things that sets Marx apart from the anarchist position to an extent, where I think he's correct, and where I actually think this is an important part of an understanding of revolution, is that without placing demands upon and challenging politics, engaging in politics, and including organizations that are somehow like parties, I don't think and again, you can see it even in what I'm saying. I'm conflating what I think and what Marx thinks, but let's do it for now. We'll unpick it. What I think is that I think that without without a campaign, without a degree of contestation, struggle, actually I don't think you get the kind of revolutionary transformation Marx is talking about in 1845. So when in the German ideology he writes the revolution is necessary not only to conquer, to defeat the ruling class, but also so that the working classes can cast off the muck of ages and become fitted to found the world anew. I think one of the things he's saying is you can't just go and make your own communes. You have to. There has to be a process of contesting, a contestatory process around this. And I think that is ultimately connected to his commitments to a certain understanding of what revolutionary practice is. And so I don't think it's just that he kind of concedes to Bakunin and then shifts in various directions. I think because I think he takes politics more seriously than Bakunin does in the end. And I think that's an important thing.
Politics in the conventional sense.
Politics in the conventional sense, yes. And I think you see that in some of the debates. I think that really is in the debates. And I also think that just as I think you can accuse, this gets pretty. I mean, I would tend to agree that there's a kind of deep historical misunderstanding between Bakunin and Marx, right? I mean, both of them think the other is an elitist manipulator of the First International. And being raised in the political tradition I was raised in, I of course think Bakunin was and Marx wasn't. But your other opinions are available, and I fully accept that there is not enough historical engagement in the book. I completely accept that. Though I suppose I wouldn't say that means that it's completely abstract. I think that what I'm trying to do is draw out is as you said at the start, reflect on this relationship between theory and practice and think about if it means anything to be a Marxist today, it means to have a certain understanding of the relationship between theory and practice. And maybe that gets me onto the second, I think, major criticism, which was about not taking seriously some changes. So again, I'll take the punch to an extent. I agree that has to be done and I don't do it. I might dispute whether it's my job to do it or any individual's job to do it, but it's a collective task that absolutely has to be undertaken by someone. Not by someone, by many people, and preferably in the kind of organizations that I'm writing about, rather than for all the reasons we talked about, rather than up here and over there. But I also want to push back a little because it is absolutely true that that much of what we would now think of as the old industrial working class has become conservative. I'm not convinced it's particularly helpful, even in Marxist terms, to talk about, for example, the people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn as the middle class, unless my entire generation is middle class. Maybe that's true, but I don't think in the Marxist sense they are. They work for a living, they are heavily exploited, they are heavily in debt, they have an education, but the education is a prerequisite for their exploitation and for their jobs. And so it isn't really people like us, it's people like them. And of course there's some very important differences in the lives they live, the forms of organization that might work for them and might not work for them, and the kinds of, and of course the kinds of work they do. But I think they are working class in Marx's sense of working class. And so I think, when you look at, say, strikes of teachers, yes, they're middle class in some sense, but they strike and they have forms of collective action and so on. And I think that, so I agree, it's an urgent task to think about what those are that's adequate to the present. But and one more thing is they talk about themselves in the language of class. Less so, I agree, not so much in this country, but people talk about themselves in the language of class in the West much more than they did when I started writing the book 10 years ago. So I don't think it's entirely, I don't think it's so simple. That's what I would say to that. But I completely agree it's an urgent task. I hope that maybe answers something. Leave it there for now.
Okay, so thank you very much.